Hello, welcome to Weimar, and welcome to the Iphigenia Inquiry. I've come to the Theaterplatz, outside the Deutsches Nationaltheater, the German National Theatre, to see Ernst Rietschel's 1857 bronze monument celebrating the centenary of the birth of Duke Karl August, and in particular, the achievements of Goethe and Schiller. Goethe lived here in Weimar 200 years ago, from 1775 until his death in 1832, and he was director at the Court Theatre for many of these years. Schiller lived in the area too for almost 15 years and wrote many plays for Goethe to direct. Notice how Goethe's hand rests lightly on Schiller's shoulder. The older man is in formal court dress and holds a laurel wreath, symbol of ancient Greek civilization, while the younger man is in ordinary clothing but reaches out to take the wreath too. Weimar was one of the prime intellectual centres in Germany at the time that these two figures lived here, and since then many commentators have regarded the city as something akin to the spiritual heart of Germany. In 1919, for instance, immediately after the First World War, when a new National Assembly needed to create a constitution for a new republic, it moved out of Berlin and came to Weimar, partly for reasons of security to get away from the turmoil of political unrest in the capital, but also for the symbolic heritage associated with the town. The assembly was convened in the National Theatre building behind me, and the Weimar Republic was established. Weimar became a part of East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, following the Second World War. But soon after reunification, the city was reopened to all Germans and Europeans and designated a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in recognition of the Goethe period classical heritage and of the Bauhaus, which was also established here in 1919. And in 1999, on the threshold of the new millennium, it was the first German city after Berlin to be selected as a European capital of culture. There were concerts and plays, new operas, and an opportunity to reflect again upon the symbolism embodied in the city's heritage. Today, Weimar is a small city, a town. Berlin is 50 times larger in terms of population. Weimar has less than 70,000 inhabitants. Naturally, it doesn't have the wide scope of cultural activities equivalent to other larger German cities such as Munich or Frankfurt, but the theatre is still a playhouse and an opera house. There's a full-size orchestra here, the Staatskapelle conducted by Kirill Karabits, and the city, as a representation of certain ideas and symbols, retains an important voice, as I hope to show. So, what exactly does it mean for a city to be a spiritual heart? I'd like to think about what this metaphor might mean applied today. And actually, I've identified 50 locations in Weimar and the surrounding area that I'd like to visit in the process of answering this question. But perhaps the first step will be to look further at what Weimar meant at various junctures in the past. Goethe's half a century in the dukedom of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, of which Weimar was the capital and administrative centre, spanned a period when many thinkers were attracted to or invited to join the liberal and free-thinking political climate here. The intellectual environment was characterised by a spirit of inquiry that looked to all new knowledge, whether political or empirical or epistemological, as a source of interest. It was an invigorating place for Goethe to introduce a fresh approach to poetry and literature, as well as to write treatises on botany, anatomy and colour. Other figures such as Schiller, Fichte, Schelling and Hegel all came here in the spirit of the Enlightenment, overcoming the restraints of the past and sharing a commitment to explore new modes of thinking, including that posited by probably the most influential figure of all, Immanuel Kant, whose work on transcendental idealism was published from the 1780s. I intend to consider Kant's work and influence in a little more depth in episode 5, but for now I should introduce a fundamental premise of German and Weimar idealism, which argues that the world people perceive around them does not necessarily exist independently of their perception of that world. The attributes of objects that people perceive, such as the shape and size, the location in space and time, and the meaning of those objects, are dependent upon the view of the observer. These objects are seen not as entities that exist in and of themselves, but as functions or characteristics which represent the workings of the human mind. This statue is made of bronze, which is an alloy comprised mostly of copper mixed together with a few other metals to make it rigid. An idealist view of things, as characterised by Kant and many of the figures involved here in Weimar, would say that the bronze statue should not be conceived as a real thing existing independently of the human mind. It's easy to see how the meaning of the statue, the representation of Goethe and Schiller, and even the fact that the statue is conceived as a statue at all, are constructs of the human mind. Any wandering cat or dog, or even a deer come from the woods all around into the Theaterplatz, is not going to perceive the square or the statue in the same way that its human design is intended, given that such things are mind-dependent. However, idealism extends the same principle to all other attributes. It argues that the concepts of bronze and metal alloy and copper being comprised of 29 protons and electrons are not necessarily real in themselves, but constructs of the mind. Similarly, the notions of standing beside something, or seeing something, or understanding something are constructions of the mind. There is nothing that can be conceived that is not mind-dependent. Kantian idealism concludes that anything that might exist beyond the mind is, by definition, impenetrable to the mind. If the leading figures of Weimar's classical period were focused above all else on the relationship between the mind and nature, between knowledge and the objects of knowledge, between mental states and that which is represented of the world by way of those mental states, then to explore the legacy and the meaning of Weimar today requires that I explore the same issue. What do we know today about knowing, given our modern technology and our new understandings pertaining to neurobiology and cognitive science? If Goethe and his contemporaries said that actually there's no separation between mind and nature, they're the same thing, do we argue today in the same way that mental thoughts and brain activity are the same thing? If Goethe said the implication of this interconnectedness is that the organic qualities people perceive in nature are a kind of mirror of the organic qualities of thought, then how do we in the modern era view the relationship between ourselves and the world? Is there an integral relationship that exists between subjective perception and objective fact? The central position held in these issues by Goethe and Schiller-era thinkers posited that the building of a better world, committed to values of freedom and social justice, must begin with the self. And as a writer, that meant expressing new ideas of justice based upon a cognitive orientation and of learning as an objective in itself. In support of these values, soon after he arrived in Weimar and before Kant had published his first critique, Goethe had turned his attention to the triumphs of ancient Greek civilization more than 2,000 years before, and in particular its achievements in literature and as regards the development of democracy and a civil state. Adapting a drama written by Euripides, he wrote a first prose version of the namesake of this inquiry, Iphigenia Inquiry, in 1779, which, in a later version reworked into verse, remains a part of the theatre's repertoire today. Iphigenia has been saved from a sacrifice intended to raise the winds that will blow Agamemnon's ships to battle at Troy. The goddess Artemis has taken her to the island of Taris to serve as priestess. Her family thinks the sacrifice was carried out based on the immutable demands of the goddess, and that the girl is dead. Her mother has murdered Agamemnon to avenge his role in the sacrifice, and her brother, following the advice of Apollo, has in turn murdered their mother for killing their father. They're all caught up in a world where the gods act and make demands according to whim, arbitrarily and without consistency, like the weather, like the forces of nature. The gods are capricious and deceitful. They're hypocritical. The only way for mortals to handle circumstances, including saving their own skins, is to be opportunistic and resourceful. But then Goethe's version treats the role of Iphigenia very differently. She is a moral person, principled and honourable. She's articulate and can express her views about rights and responsibilities. Artemis is barely present. Instead, the drama revolves around political debate concerning justice and morality. Instead of trying to subvert the King of Taos to secure her and her brother's freedom, there is dialogue. Iphigenia speaks the truth with the king and encourages him to do the same with her. She chooses her words carefully and tries to persuade him to look to reason and to abandon violence, and not to respond merely to mindless whims. Goethe's Iphigenia in Tauris is a further expression of the values of the Enlightenment. It represents an end to the supremacy of dogma and the associated abuses of power. It promotes values of tolerance and of human liberty, and above all, the significance of coherence and reason above duplicity and the manipulation of others. Goethe places a particular emphasis on Iphigenia making reconciliation with the King of Taos so as to create a peaceful solution. And in a sense, this is the principle above all others that is core to the symbolism of Weimar. The dukedom of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach sought to calm the waters of unrest by way of reconciliation between the established conventions of monarchy and the emancipatory tides of republicanism without resort to the revolutionary guillotine. Thereafter, the establishment of democracy in the Weimar Republic involved reconciliation between conflicting political factions sparring for dominance in the wake of an immensely difficult era. The Bauhaus, too, represented reconciliation between the lofty aspirations of fine art and the down-to-earth goals of the crafts traditions. And then there's a reconciliation between the objective world and the subjective. Before Goethe's time, many 18th century writers had commented on the sense of alienation they felt from society and the world, in particular as a result of the new scientific conceptions of the cosmos, which they argued had turned the world into a heartless machine, whereby notions of a spiritual heart or of human purposiveness in general had no meaning. Goethe's Iphigenia, then, as an archetype and antecedent of Weimar reconciliation, written even before Idealism promised an explanation of an integrated mind and world, was presented as an exemplar of how to resolve these questions. Rather than having no meaning, as proposed by Newtonian physics, human agency and efficacy was to be considered central to achieving goals such as social justice and a better world. As may be apparent by now, the purpose of this inquiry is not merely to visit Weimar sites and recall historical anecdotes, as a tourist guide might do. The purpose is not to show as many angles on the Goethe-Schiller monument as possible. The goal is to explore the heart of Weimar, but actually this is not necessary to be found in its buildings and museums, fascinating as they are. I shall be working from the premise that the essence of Weimar, as characterized by its historical heritage, is to be found above all in the ideas it represents, and in particular, ideas about the mind. Before I finish this first episode, I should define more clearly what I mean by mind. I don't have a map of Weimar to hand, those are available elsewhere, but to facilitate a better understanding of German idealism and the themes I intend to address, I've created a simple orientation map of the mind, divided into 3 levels. Here it is. Firstly, there's the entity of mind, that which exists as a being in itself. Then, there's the consciousness and self-reflective awareness possessed by that entity, the perception of the self and of the self being aware of itself. And then, there are the processes and intentional mental states utilized by the agency that is that entity. I should emphasize, this is not intended as a biological diagram. Furthermore, the purpose of showing 3 levels is not to suggest a hierarchy, or even to suggest the mind actually has 3 component parts. This is only a rough guide after all. It doesn't even have geographical features like hopeful hills or wishing woods or regretful rivers. But it illustrates how a consideration of mind might distinguish, at least as a starting point, between different categories. Many developments pertaining to the mind and the brain today, whether philosophical or neurological or anywhere in between, typically deal with only one of these levels. In particular, there's a lot of research carried out today by psychologists and cognitive scientists pertaining to the 3rd level and mind processes and mental states. and this level could be divided into many, many subsections if my map was to be made more detailed. However, even here I made note of the phenomenal and the intentional, because I shall refer to these particular processes frequently. In the case of German idealism, I hope to show that the Weimar tradition was interested above all else in investigating the second and third levels of mind as a means to explain the first level. The mind dependence of properties and events was an exploration of mental states and self-reflexivity that supported a unified realm of existence, which in turn supported the process of self-enlightenment and existential advancement. Kant would have said that unconscious sensibility is a prior condition to understanding and thereafter reason, both of which are self-conscious level 3 processes perceptible to level 2 consciousness and revealing of the level 1 existential reality of mind. The goal is for level 1 entity to know more of what it is, other than just an entity served by conscious and procedural states. So, by way of introduction, it's my intent to explore a Weimar thesis whereby the entity of mind determines the world, consciousness and self-awareness can perceive the entity of mind determining the world, in particular by way of aesthetical and philosophical insight, and processes and states of mind can be perceived as products of interaction caused in the process of the entity of mind determining the world. The Weimar thesis was proposed more than 200 years ago, and a lot has happened since then as regards the development of knowledge. Empirical discoveries and technology have changed the world. My inquiry will ask if this thesis still stands. Has the world confirmed it, or refuted it, or perhaps simply moved on? The inquiry will begin with 3 introductory episodes, given there are other factors that must be taken into consideration, and then consider methodology. Thereafter, I'll visit a range of sites in Weimar while looking in more depth at matters of epistemology and metaphysics in particular. My intent is to publish a new episode every week or two, as time allows, and I hope you can join me. Thanks for listening.